everybody. Well, let's get started. Yay! My name is Brian Steinman, and I'm head of technical services. I'm one of the library faculty, and I've been here for 33 long years. And welcome to our STIR Talk. This is the 12th in the series. So we started in September of 2012. And Kevin had done another one, the 4th in the series, so this is his second one now. And I'm glad you're all here. I'm pleased to introduce Kevin. He and I go back a long way and have known each other since probably college days. Kevin is a Nebraskan through and through. He grew up in a farm in western Nebraska. And they grew wheat, and so Kevin knows what it's like to be in a tractor and smell a lot of dust. Then he graduated from Grant High School and then went on to get his undergraduate degree and his law degree here at UNL. He's been practicing law since 1979. He started out at Nebraska Western Legal Services in 1979, and he practiced there for a while and eventually becoming the managing attorney there. And then we were lucky enough to capture him in 1985, and he is the director of our clinical programs. And it's really interesting for he and I to see each other once in a while in the hallway and realize that we had roommated together in college. So that's a really interesting thing how life sometimes gives you that. His outreach faculty work on law reform and legal education projects sees him visiting a lot of countries, such as Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. There is more information about Professor Ruser, like all of the faculty, on the web pages, so if you're curious to see some more stuff that he's done, that's great. Also, these series are available on YouTube channel. So if you want to see any of the series, just Google YouTube Nebraska, and you'll get us. So that being said, Kevin, the floor is yours.
So today I'm going to talk about this case that's in front of the U.S. Supreme Court now, Mellouli versus Holder. And it's an interesting case primarily because of the facts. It's a very probable case, but I think it's a real good illustration of what I call the categorical analysis in crimmigration law. Crimmigration law is shorthand for law that is involved in the intersection of criminal law and immigration law. And every criminal defense lawyer has a Sixth Amendment obligation to advise his or her non-U.S. citizen client of the immigration consequences of criminal proceedings. It's been an area of interest of mine for a while, and it's because it's really fun because of cases like this. But let's look at the facts of this case. So, Mr. Mellouli is a foreign national who entered the U.S. on a student visa in 2004. And he completed his education. He got his bachelor's in 2006. He got his master's in 2009. Excuse me. He became a conditional permanent resident in 2009. I won't go into detail about what that means, but it's sort of like being on probation for a couple of years. But then he got that probation removed in 2011 and became a full-fledged lawful permanent resident. In the meantime, I guess between 2009 when he got his conditional resident status and 2011 when he got his permanent status, he wanted to celebrate, and he went out and had a few drinks and then drove, and he got popped for driving while intoxicated. When he was booked into jail, the deputies found 4 tablets, 4 pills in his sock, which he admitted were Adderall. And I know none of you know what Adderall is or probably have any connection with Adderall, but I'm told that some students may know that it's a controlled substance that you need a prescription for. And he had no prescription for it, and so he was charged with possession of a controlled substance and possession of drug paraphernalia. And so he pled to possession of the drug paraphernalia. And the drug paraphernalia under the Kansas statute was his sock. Right? He was storing drugs in his sock. So the drug paraphernalia that he pled guilty to possessing was his sock. In 2012, 2 years later, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, put him into deportation proceedings because of that conviction. They said you're deportable because you were convicted of a drug paraphernalia offense. and they want to remove you from the country. He contested that. He lost in front of the immigration court. He appealed it to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the next step up administratively in the chain. He lost there, and then from there you go to the circuit courts of appeal. He appealed it to the 8th Circuit, and also lost there. He was removed from the United States for possessing his sock, and is permanently inadmissible because this particular kind of conviction does not allow you to re-enter the United States, and there is no waiver for that. So he's currently outside of the United States. Nevertheless, his case is still alive because you can still pursue these claims, the courts of hell, even though you've been removed, because you may be able to come back in at some point. Now, drug paraphernalia, if you take a look at the Kansas statute, I've redacted it here a little bit, or sort of limited it down, but here's the definition under the Kansas statute. All materials of any kind which are used in storing a controlled substance. So all of the elements of that criminal offense were met, right? A sock is a material of some kind. It was used by him to store a controlled substance, which is the Adderall pills, the 4 Adderall pills. So that's what he was convicted of. That's the statute under which he was convicted in Kansas. The statute that I've passed out, that you may have copies of, is the Immigration and Nationality Act provision, under which ICE sought to deport him and actually was successful in deporting him. And if you take a look at that, you can see kind of how this argument sets up. Any alien who at any time after admission, so after he was admitted to the United States, has been convicted of a violation of any law or regulation of a state, the United States, or a foreign country relating to a controlled substance, as defined in Section 102 of the Federal Controlled Substances Act, is deportable. Forget about this stuff, possession of marijuana language in there. So he was convicted of a violation of the state of Kansas related to a controlled substance, a drug paraphernalia offense, and that made him deportable. So that's the statute under which ICE was successful in getting him deported. And so the question in front of the Supreme Court, paraphrased by me, is can you deport this guy for possessing a sock? Not only a sock, but his sock. The government says, yes, you can, because it's a well-established principle in immigration law that a drug paraphernalia crime is a crime related to a controlled substance under the federal statute. And so this was a drug paraphernalia possession offense, it's a crime related to a controlled substance, and therefore he's deportable. Mr. Mellouli says, to channel the guy under his pen whose name escapes me right now. Anyway, not so fast, my friend. I'm not deportable when the categorical analysis is used. And the rest of us say, what the heck is the categorical analysis, right? So, the brilliance of my presentation is that 6 minutes of it is a YouTube video. So, right now we're going to take a look, because Maureen Sweeney at the University of Maryland, one of my colleagues in this area, and Professor Shaver's colleagues also, has put together a video that explains the categorical approach better than anything that I could have come up with.
Firefox.
Pardon me?
Firefox.
Firefox.
There you go.
So I'm going to play that for you guys because I think it does a great job.
Categorical Analysis of Immigration Consequences. Non-citizens can be deported or suffer other serious immigration consequences because of criminal convictions. These consequences often include deportation and can sometimes be surprising in their severity and disproportionality, and it's not always intuitively clear when they will be applied. To find out whether a conviction will trigger immigration consequences, you have to look to the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, the Federal Immigration Statute, and see whether the offense of conviction falls within any of the categories in the INA that trigger deportation or other consequences. The next question is how to determine whether an offense falls within one of these categories. To do this, courts use a categorical analysis. This means that the judge compares the elements of the state statute of conviction with the elements of the federal immigration category to see if the state elements are a match for, or if they are included within, the elements of the federal category. In other words, does every violation of the state statute necessarily involve a violation of the federal offense or fall within the federal category? If so, the state statute is a categorical match for the federal category, and immigration consequences will be triggered by the state conviction. On the other hand, if the offense of conviction criminalizes a broader swath of conduct than the immigration category, then the offense is considered overbroad. An overbroad offense is categorically not a match for the federal offense and can't be used to impose immigration consequences. The categorical analysis does not consider the facts of what the individual actually did. The actual facts of the case are irrelevant to the analysis. The only question is whether the minimum conduct required to convict someone under a particular offense necessarily meets all the elements of the federal offense category. The Supreme Court recently reaffirmed the categorical approach in a case called Decamp v. United States. Here's how the court used the analysis in that case. The first step was to define the elements of the federal offense that provided the standard for triggering federal consequences. A federal offense may be a statutory or a so-called generic offense, and you may find the elements in a federal statute, in case law, or even spelled out in pattern jury instructions. The key is to identify the elements that a jury must agree upon in order to convict someone of the offense. In the Decamp case, the Supreme Court was analyzing the federal generic offense of burglary. Federal case law defines the elements of generic burglary as an unlawful entry into a building or structure with the intent to commit a crime. In order for a state conviction to trigger federal consequences as a burglary offense, the state offense would have to meet all of these elements in every case. In Decamp, the Supreme Court compared a California burglary statute that had the elements of entry into certain specific locations with the intent to commit theft or a felony. The Supreme Court focused its analysis on the first required generic federal element, unlawful entry. There was no requirement under the California statute that the entry be unlawful. For example, the state statute covers an individual who lawfully enters a store but has the intention to shoplift there. The court found that the California statute prohibited all entries as long as there was a larcenous or felonious intent, regardless of whether the entries were lawful or not. As a result, the court concluded that the first state element swept more broadly than the corresponding federal element. In short, it was categorically overbroad because the element of entry, which was not divisible, criminalized behavior that would not be prohibited under the federal definition. Because this element was overbroad, the court concluded that the California offense, even though it was called burglary, did not qualify as a federal burglary offense and did not trigger the additional federal consequences for a prior burglary conviction. The court made a point of emphasizing that it did not matter what Mr. Decamp had actually done in committing the crime. The question was a categorical one based on the elements of the state offense. In Justice Kagan's words, the key is elements, not facts. The court pointed out that this emphasis on elements is the same even for statutes that are divisible into alternative sets of elements that constitute different offenses, though courts can use a modified categorical approach to identify the relevant elements in those cases. But that is a topic for another time. The court's analysis in Decamp is a perfect example of the strict categorical analysis. If an indivisible element of a state offense of conviction is broader than its federal counterpart, a conviction for that offense will not trigger the imposition of additional federal consequences.
Okay, so that is a real good explanation of categorical approach in this area. And so what we have in this case is Mr. Mellouli arguing essentially that the categorical approach applies here. Because the state statute's overbroad. Why is it overbroad? Because there are 9 drugs on the Kansas controlled substances list that aren't on the federal list. There's 9 additional drugs on the Kansas list. So it's an overbroad statute, and therefore it doesn't trigger deportation consequences. And there was no evidence in the record. We know it was Adderall from other reasons, but in the formal record that was presented to the immigration court, there was no evidence as to which drug it was. And so in theory, it could have been any of the 9 drugs on the state schedule or on the federal schedule. And if he was convicted of that, the argument goes, he wasn't convicted of a drug that's on the federal controlled substances schedules, therefore overbroad statute, therefore you can't report it because you have to assume he was convicted of the least offensive, as far as the federal statute is concerned, offense. And if he was convicted of possessing a drug that's not on the federal schedules, he's not reportable under the statute. The government's argument is, well, when this relates to language in 1227, just means that it has to generally relate to drug trade. It doesn't have to specifically relate to a Section 802 controlled substance. And also, you guys up there on the bench, the Board of Immigration Appeals has held that this is the case, and there's this principle of administrative law called deference, Chevron deference. You have to give deference to an agency's interpretation of the laws that it's supposed to administer. And also, the state schedules are pretty close to the federal schedules. They were adopted as part of, and I love this language, an interlocking trellis of federal and state law to combat drug abuse. So it was Congress's intent, even though this drug might not be on the federal schedules. And there's a little more than a theoretical possibility that he might be deported because he probably wasn't charged with one of these possession offenses that relate to the 9 drugs that are on the federal schedule. So this case got argued before the Supreme Court on January 14th. If you read the transcript of the argument, most observers, and I would agree with this, think the court was pretty skeptical of the government's argument. The government hasn't fared very well on these cases, on these immigration cases of statutory interpretation in recent years. And so the sort of conventional wisdom is that Mr. Mellouli's SOC probably won't permanently exclude him from the country, but we'll have to find out when the decision comes out sometime in June. So, Jody, where am I at on the time?
You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I'll take all the questions you have in 30 seconds. If you don't have any, then we can go back to eating and drinking. Okay, time's up. Thank you.